Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lecture about liberalism. So, as you had read about for this week, there are different versions of liberalism. There's the classic variety, the modern variety, there's liberal democracy, but liberalism in all of its varieties has some core underlying themes, which are individualism, freedom, reason, justice, and tolerance. And those stem from both the time periods in which classical liberalism emerged, as well as how modern liberalism was developed also to respond to changes in historical and contemporary circumstances. So, as I already mentioned, different types of liberalism, and I'm just going to show you a few slides to clarify the differences between them. So, classical liberalism emerged in response to challenges that were being made to the divine right of kings and absolutism, right? So it is often referred to as 19th century liberalism because it really was in its heyday during the early industrialization period, but it also involved, out of the Enlightenment, this idea that individuals and not groups and not kings had rights, and those rights needed to be protected. And really, the desire was to limit government and promote those individual freedoms. So here are some main ideas of classical liberalism. And what you should really take away from this is that individuals as a group started to become important, right? This is when you had the idea, which was novel, that individual people had some rights because they were human, right? And so the role of government was to protect those individual rights and the ability of people to maximize their utility, right? Whether that be their own personal utility in terms of happiness, their economic utility, right? This was the idea that society is a meritocracy, and if you happen to be poor, that was a reflection of your innate abilities. So, really, the main thing to emphasize here is that government was designed to protect individual rights and freedoms, and those freedoms were really being free from the government in telling you what you needed to do, right? And to that end, when it came to economics, the government should take a step back, right? The government should not be involved heavily in regulating the economy. It should really let that invisible hand of the market do its magic. And that is a way in which individuals could also exercise their freedom. Now, modern liberalism came about a bit later, and it too emerged in response to industrialization, but not in the early phase. In the phase of industrialization, where you started to see, some economic development happening, obviously, but that economic development was very lopsided, right? There were some segments of society that were really getting rich and doing great, and others, workers that were being exploited, that didn't have any rights, right? Here you have a picture of children who worked in factories as opposed to being in schools. And so it really emerged as a result of the social and the economic inequalities that came to the forefront as the industrialization period continued to develop, right? And thinkers of that time started to question the idea of, well, is it really that beneficial for society as a whole that we allow individuals to just always be trying to maximize their utility? Is that how you build a society of free and just individuals? And the answer of modern liberals was no, right? So the main ideas of modern liberalism are still in that same vein of the core tenets that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, but it again focused on things like trying to ensure that the government actually played a greater role in making sure that individuals could pursue their goals and could realize their potential in society, because it appeared that just letting capitalism run its course led to a lot of individuals who were on the losing end of the economic bargain as opposed to the winning end, and that the market on its own was not going to be able to provide for a lot of these services. And so that's where the government needed to play a much more prominent role, right? We're still talking about freedom, we're still talking about individuals, but there's a different view of the role of government in helping individuals become more free. And so here's some tensions between the two. Again, still talking about liberalism, but there's differences between what is being emphasized within these flavors of liberalism, and especially differences in the role of the government with respect to providing for more or less of a social safety net for people, with the idea that doing so is promoting individual freedom. All right, liberal democracy also falls within this realm of liberalism. Liberal democracy has two components, right? Basically, you have some rules that govern the people who are in charge. Whether that's a written constitution that is easy or hard to change. There may not be an explicit written constitution, but there may be laws that still govern those who are in charge. You have checks and balances, separation of powers, right? Making sure that the executive doesn't trample on the rights of everybody. And then liberal democracy also has a democratic component, which this is a quote from Abraham Lincoln, right? It's government of, by, and for the people, right? So you have some element of responsiveness, of accountability that the government has to have to the people who vote for it. And that you can ultimately, if you are unhappy with what the government is doing, the next election cycle, right, vote somebody else in. This is a figure from a data set called the Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM. The next slide has a link to where you can find this information. And VDEM has a variable called Regimes of the World that categorizes countries according to their regimes. And I wanted to show this to demonstrate which countries in 2024, because that's the latest year for which they have this data available, are considered liberal democracies. And on the figure here, you can see what their definition of liberal democracy is, and it does provide for more checks and balances of the rulers who are in charge, right? Now, as your reading had talked about for this week, although democratization and liberal democracy seemed to have its heyday, especially in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, when many countries in the world were democratizing, and we actually had multiple waves, about 3 waves of democratization that happened, that seems to be reversing, which is in fact a troubling trend. Although it was not mentioned in your textbook, VDEM has done a lot of research about this, and democracies do outperform autocracies on a whole host of different outcomes, including economic development, providing for social safety nets, doing a better job of protecting the environment and women's rights, etc. So these can be thought of as some concerning trends as we see countries autocratizing as opposed to democratizing, right? Where you are removing those checks and balances that are meant to prevent rulers from trampling on the rights of individuals, which again, individuals are very much part of the idea of liberalism. And here is just some additional information for you if you wanted to know what aspect of democracy is becoming the most downgraded recently. VDEM has this figure on the right, which you can examine. And here is some additional, or on the left rather, and here's some additional information on the right. And if you want, you can go to this particular link right here and access and read their report.